The Diary of Anne Frank is easily one of the most morally complex and emotionally devastating Hollywood productions of the post-war era. A 1959 film that arrived carrying the weight of 6 million dead, the testimony of one teenage girl, and the near impossible task of making the industrialized murder of an entire people legible to an American mainstream audience that, in many cases, still barely understood what the Holocaust actually was. So, let's take a look behind the scenes of the film with 15 dark facts you didn't know about The Diary of Anne Frank, including the legendary actress who turned down the title role for reasons that will stop you cold, the suppressed first screenplay that sparked one of the most bitter legal battles in Hollywood history, and the single most devastating detail about Anne Frank's actual death, a detail the film, even at 170 minutes, cannot bring itself to fully face. The diary should not exist. On the morning of August 4th, 1944, the German security service raided the secret annex at 263 Prinsengracht in Amsterdam and arrested all 8 people hiding there. In the chaos that followed, the Gestapo officer in charge seized Otto Frank's briefcase, searching for valuables, for money, for anything of use, and emptied its contents across the floor. Scattered across those wooden floorboards were Anne Frank's diary and her loose notebooks of writing. The officer left them where they fell. 2 of the office workers who had been helping to conceal the Frank family, Miep Gaze and Bep Voskuil, crept back up to the annex after the arrest and gathered what they could find. Miep took the diary pages and the notebooks and locked them in her desk drawer without reading a single line, intending to return them to Anne when the war ended. She kept them there, untouched, until Otto Frank, the sole survivor of the 8 people who had hidden in the annex, came to her to say that Anne was dead. She handed them over unread. He wept for days before he could open them. Every frame of the 1959 film exists because Miep Gies picked scattered papers off a wooden floor and had the discipline not to read them. Now, to understand how those diary pages became a major Hollywood production and how contentious and politically ugly that journey was, you have to understand a man named Meyer Levin. Meyer Levin was an American Jewish journalist and novelist who had covered the liberation of the Nazi camps as a war correspondent. He had personally encountered Otto Frank in Europe, had read the diary, and became a key with something approaching obsessive fervor, its most passionate American advocate. He helped secure the diary's U.S. publication, wrote a glowing review in the New York Times Book Review without disclosing his personal stake in its success, and believed he had an implicit understanding with Otto Frank that he would write the stage adaptation. His version was submitted to 14 producers in succession. All 14 rejected it. When Otto Frank subsequently commissioned Francis Goodrich and Albert Hackett, a husband and wife Hollywood writing team known for comedies and musicals, Levin sued, charging fraud, breach of contract, and wrongful appropriation of ideas. He argued that the Goodrich-Hackett version had systematically stripped the diary of its Jewish particularity, that it had universalized Anne Frank's story to make it more palatable to a Gentile audience, at the cost of the very thing that made the diary irreplaceable. A New York jury awarded him $50,000. The presiding judge subsequently set the award aside on procedural grounds. Levin eventually settled for $15,000. He titled his memoir about the ordeal, The Obsession. He died in 1981, still arguing. He was not entirely wrong. So, who were the writers who replaced him, and why is that choice, in retrospect, so revealing? Francis Goodrich and Albert Hackett were, by the mid-1950s, one of Hollywood's most accomplished writing partnerships. Their credits included The Thin Man, Easter Parade, and It's a Wonderful Life, Screwball Wit, Musical Verve, the comfortable grammar of popular American entertainment. The commission to adapt Anne Frank's diary was something categorically different. They were not Holocaust writers, they were not deeply immersed in Jewish intellectual culture, and Otto Frank's own initial response to their early drafts was reportedly cool. He wrote to the Hacketts that while he found the work technically proficient, he was not moved by it, that it lacked the psychological truth of the people he had actually known and loved. The Hacketts revised. They consulted a liberal rabbi. They corresponded at length with Otto Frank. The play that eventually emerged won the Pulitzer Prize in 1955 and set a template that would persist through Sophie's Choice, through Schindler's List, through virtually every major Holocaust drama that followed it. The universalized narrative, emotionally accessible and morally clear, in which the specifically Jewish horror is present but not central, because centrality would narrow the audience. Meyer Levin called this a betrayal. The Pulitzer Committee called it great drama. That argument has never been resolved. However, before the film even had a confirmed director, the production had already lost its first one. William Wyler was originally in talks to direct The Diary of Anne Frank. Wyler was, in 1957, arguably the most reliably prestigious director in Hollywood, a man who had just come off Friendly Persuasion and was about to make Ben-Hur. He understood intimate chamber drama. He understood European history from within his own Jewish family background. The deal did not come together. George Stevens stepped in, as producer first, then as director, and the film became his entirely. But the question of what a Wyler version might have looked like is a genuinely interesting counterfactual. Wyler's instincts ran toward classical economy, clean geometry, tight performance, nothing wasted. Stevens, as it turned out, brought something that no studio negotiation could have anticipated or replaced: a personal, documented, and deeply traumatic connection to the material that would shape every creative decision he made on the film. Now, before any director was confirmed, the studio had one specific name in mind for the title role, and it was a name that, had she said yes, would have produced a fundamentally different film. Audrey Hepburn was the first choice. Both George Stevens and Otto Frank personally wanted her. On paper, the logic was irresistible. Hepburn was the most luminous young actress in Hollywood, European by upbringing, and possessed precisely the quality of trembling, intelligent hope that the role seemed to demand. What the studio's calculation could not fully account for was Hepburn's own personal history. She had grown up in Arnhem, 60 miles from Amsterdam, 60 miles from the annex during the Nazi occupation of the Netherlands. She had lived through the hunger winter of 1944. She had nearly starved to death. Her uncle, Otto van Limburg-Stierum, had been executed by the Nazis as a reprisal hostage. She had secretly performed ballets to raise money for the Dutch resistance. She had read Anne's diary when it was first published in 1947, and the experience had devastated her. When asked to play the role that Otto Frank himself was pleading with her to accept, she said, "I was so destroyed by it again that I said I couldn't deal with it. It's a little bit as if this had happened to my sister." She called Anne Frank her soul sister. She turned it down. In later years, she read from the diary at concerts to raise money for UNICEF. Her way, perhaps, of honoring the obligation she could not fulfill on screen. So, if not Hepburn, then who? And had the actress who had already played Anne Frank considered taking the role to the screen? Susan Strasberg had originated the role of Anne Frank on Broadway in 1955, winning enormous critical acclaim and, at 20 years old, becoming one of the most discussed stage debuts of the decade. When the film went into production, the assumption in some quarters was that Strasberg would naturally carry the role to the screen. She did not want to. She declined to reprise a performance she had already given at such sustained emotional intensity, in such a fundamentally different medium, under a director of Stevens's particular seriousness, with the additional weight of Otto Frank's personal involvement pressing down on every scene. She stepped away from the role that had defined the opening chapter of her career. The vacancy she left became the most scrutinized casting search in Hollywood since Gone with the Wind, a global search conducted across Amsterdam, Israel, and New York, reported in newspapers with a breathlessness usually reserved for space launches. And the person that search eventually produced was, by any conventional standard, a deeply improbable choice. Millie Perkins was 18 years old, a fashion model from New Jersey who had appeared on the cover of 17 magazine and had never acted in a film in her life. She was not a product of drama school. She had no stage background. She was a face in a magazine. George Stevens cast her. His publicly stated reasoning was that he wanted an unknowingness, a rawness that trained performance might smooth away. But the decisive moment came not in a screen test. It came at a dinner. Perkins met Otto Frank at his home, and the two of them went into his library to talk. During the conversation, Otto Frank noticed the way she was holding her hands, her thumb tucked inside her four fingers. He recognized something in it, something of Anne. He gave his approval. Perkins spent the subsequent shoot operating under a pressure that is almost impossible to quantify. A first-time actress, carrying one of the most beloved stories in the world, with the subject's grieving father on the studio floor watching. "She has a wonderful face," Stevens told the press at the time. "Never acted before in her life, but I thought she did very well." But if there is one person whose personal history gave the entire production its moral foundation, whose presence behind the camera this film could not have existed without, it is Stevens himself. George Stevens did not arrive at this material through a commercial calculation. Coming off Giant in 1956, for which he had won the Academy Award for Best Director, he was at the peak of his industry standing and could have made virtually anything. He chose Anne Frank. The reason was not primarily artistic. During the Second World War, Stevens had served as a colonel in the U.S. Army Special Coverage Unit, a small team of military filmmakers assigned to record the Allied advance across Europe. In April 1945, Stevens and his unit entered Dachau in the days following its liberation. He filmed what he found there. The footage became evidence at the Nuremberg trials. Stevens maintained a personal color film reel of his Dachau footage he never publicly screened. Colleagues consistently described him in the years after the war as a profoundly and permanently changed man. More deliberate, more interior, more haunted by something they could not entirely name. The Diary of Anne Frank was, for George Stevens, not a prestige commission. It was a form of witness, a debt he believed he owed to what he had seen and filmed in a liberated concentration camp, 14 years before the first frame was shot. So, having committed to the production with that degree of personal gravity, Stevens immediately ran into a studio confrontation that would shape the film's entire visual identity. George Stevens did not want to shoot the Diary of Anne Frank in CinemaScope. He said so explicitly and at length. CinemaScope, the wide horizontal format that 20th Century Fox had been imposing on the majority of its productions since 1953, was a commercial weapon designed to make cinema look too big for a television screen. Stevens' argument was that it was entirely wrong for this story, that a drama set inside a hidden apartment, defined by claustrophobia and confinement, required a tight, compressed visual grammar, not an expansive one. The studio president, Spyros Skouras, overruled him. Stevens' response was characteristically ingenious. He had his production designers build large structural columns into the annex set, ostensibly representing the attic's supporting beams, which physically narrowed the usable center of the CinemaScope frame and forced all dramatic action into an airless corridor of space. He fought the studio's decision with carpentry. Cinematographer William C. Meller further reinforced this visual suffocation by using fluorescent tubes, filters, and gas lighting in place of conventional studio illumination. The result is a film that looks like nothing else in the Fox catalog of the period. A widescreen movie that has engineered its own imprisonment inside the frame it was forced to use. Now, the production's most quietly devastating moment had nothing to do with any of that. About 4 months into the shoot, George Stevens arranged for Otto Frank to visit the set and have lunch with the cast. Shelley Winters, who played Mrs. Van Daan, recalled the day in her memoirs with the kind of granular specificity that only attaches to experiences that lodge permanently in the body. She described the cast seated at a table in their costumes, shabby, smelly wartime Dutch clothes. She wrote, and Otto Frank walking into the room, looking around at the people who were portraying his friends and his murdered family, and beginning to tremble. He had tears in his eyes. He had never seen the Broadway play. He had said simply that it would be too difficult. Coming to the studio floor at all was, as everyone in the room understood, an act of considerable personal courage. Stevens, who had stood in Dachau, who had filmed the evidence of what the Nazi state had built and operated, understood precisely what kind of weight was present in that lunchroom. So did every actor sitting at the table. Nobody, Winters wrote, said very much. They just sat there together in costume and ate. But there is one dimension of Anne's story that Otto Frank had already quietly and permanently reshaped, long before any film was ever conceived. When Otto Frank prepared Anne's diary for publication in 1947, he edited it. The critical edition, published decades later by the Netherlands Institute for War Documentation, established definitively what had been removed. He cut passages in which Anne wrote with frankness and some bitterness about her mother, Edith Frank, who had died at Auschwitz in January 1945. He removed entries in which Anne explored her adolescent sexuality with a directness he judged too private for public exposure. He deleted passages he found too interior, too raw, too wounding to offer to a world that had not yet heard his daughter's name. His motivations were those of a grieving father doing what grieving fathers do, protecting the memory of his child as he understood her from a world he did not entirely trust with the full picture. But the effect was to deliver to the world a version of Anne Frank that was somewhat smoother, somewhat more universally palatable, somewhat less specific and combative than the teenager who had actually filled those pages in that hidden apartment. The film adapts the edited version. The complete Anne, the one who was more conflicted, more angry, more unapologetically and brilliantly difficult, has never existed on screen. So, what actually happened to the people inside that apartment after the film ends? The film ends with their arrests. The history does not. Of the 8 people who had hidden in the annex, all were transported to Auschwitz-Birkenau in September 1944. Herman van Pels, Mr. Van Daan, was reportedly gassed at Auschwitz within weeks of arrival. Fritz Pfeffer, the dentist played as Mr. Dussel, died at Neuengamme concentration camp on December 20th, 1944. Peter van Pels, the teenager with whom Anne had developed a tender and carefully documented relationship in the annex, survived Auschwitz but was forced onto a death march as the Soviets advanced. He died at Mauthausen on May 5, 1945, 3 days before the Netherlands was liberated. Edith Frank died at Auschwitz on January 6, 1945. Anne and Margot were transferred to Bergen-Belsen in the autumn of 1944. Bergen-Belsen, by the winter of that year, had collapsed into catastrophe. Overcrowded, typhus-ridden, effectively abandoned by any administrative logic. Margot died first. Anne died shortly after. British forces liberated the camp on April 15, 1945. Of the 8 people who had hidden together in those rooms for 25 months, 1 survived. 1 came back. The film knows this. It cannot hold it. However, the question of who sent those 8 people to their deaths has never, despite decades of investigation, been definitively answered. The arrest on August 4th, 1944 was almost certainly the result of a deliberate tip-off to the German authorities. Who made that call remains one of the most investigated and least resolved questions in the entire history of the Second World War. In 2022, a cold case team that included retired Federal Bureau of Investigation investigators proposed Arnold Vandenberg, a Jewish notary who may have supplied names of hidden Jews to the Nazis in exchange for protection for his own family, as the most probable informer. The finding was contested by historians who considered the evidence insufficient. Several other suspects had previously been investigated and cleared across earlier decades. Miep Gies, who survived the war, lived to the age of 100 and died in 2010, said in interviews that she believed she knew who the betrayer was, but that she would never name them publicly, because an accusation without proof could only cause more suffering than it resolved. She carried that knowledge, if it was knowledge, to her grave. The film does not address the question. That silence feels, in retrospect, like one of the most honest choices in the entire production. Now, the most sustained and intellectually serious attack on the film came not from mainstream criticism, but from a man whose authority on the subject was beyond challenge. Bruno Bettelheim was a psychologist, a Holocaust survivor who had been imprisoned in both Dachau and Buchenwald in 1938 and 1939, and one of the most formidable public intellectuals in post-war America. In 1960, he published an essay in Harper's Magazine titled The Ignored Lesson of Anne Frank. It was methodical, somber, and devastating. Bettelheim argued that both the play and the film had done something actively harmful. They had aestheticized hiding, quiet, private, family unit concealment as the noble and appropriate response to genocide, when the historical record suggested that collective resistance offered better odds of survival and was, in any case, the more honest response to acknowledge. He was surgically precise about the film's emotional climax, Anne's famous declaration that she still believed people were good at heart, noting that presenting this as the story's concluding emotional truth required the audience to actively suppress what the historical record showed had happened to the 15-year-old who wrote it. The critique was sincere and rigorously argued. Otto Frank found it deeply painful. The producers found it unfair. Neither produced a satisfactory rebuttal. Bettelheim's essay remains, more than 60 years later, a document that anyone who claims to admire the film is obligated to reckon with. And the fact that sits beneath every frame, the one detail that no award, no critical rehabilitation, and no act of cultural reclamation can absorb is this. Anne Frank survived everything the film shows you. She survived the years in hiding. She survived the arrest. She survived the transport to Auschwitz. She survived the selection on the Auschwitz platform, that moment of bureaucratized murder in which SS doctors decided, with a glance, who would be killed immediately and who would be permitted to continue dying by slower means. She was transferred to Bergen-Belsen, and then Bergen-Belsen, in the winter of 1944 and 1945, disintegrated, not through systematic murder, but through catastrophic institutional collapse. Disease, starvation, typhus moving unchecked through a camp so overcrowded it had ceased to function by any administrative logic whatsoever. Anne Frank died of typhus in Bergen-Belsen in approximately February or March of 1945. She was 15 years old. British forces liberated the camp on April 15th, 1945. The war in Europe ended on May 8th. She had survived everything that was survivable, and then she died of a disease, in a tent or a barrack, somewhere between 6 and 8 weeks before the day that would have freed her. The film knows this. It shows you the arrest. It cannot show you what came after, and the space between what it knows and what it is able to bring itself to show is where this film lives, permanently and without resolution. Upon its New York premiere in March 1959, The Diary of Anne Frank received largely respectful notices, but with a consistent undercurrent of significant reservations. Writing in the New York Times, Bosley Crowther acknowledged the film's considerable strengths while concluding that it lacks the capstone strength that its material ultimately required. A pointed observation from the paper's most authoritative, critical voice. Variety was more direct, noting that despite inspired direction and vivid supporting performances, the film was simply too long, and that in its final act, the dialogue becomes forced. The film's box office performance was, by industry standards of the period, described as disappointing, a discomfiting commercial outcome for a production that had been packaged and received as a cultural event. And then, a year after release, Bruno Bettelheim published his Harper's essay, and the conversation shifted permanently from whether the film was well-made cinema to whether it was an act of historical honesty. But nowadays, The Diary of Anne Frank is recognized as a foundational and historically consequential production. The film that introduced the reality of the Holocaust to tens of millions of American viewers at a moment when that reality was still poorly and only partially understood by the mainstream. Its limitations are real and documented. Its importance is not in question, and the argument it started about how narrative owes to the dead, about what mass audiences can and cannot be asked to bear, about whether hope is comfort or evasion, is an argument that began with this film and has never been, and probably cannot be, closed. But let me know below, when it comes to The Diary of Anne Frank specifically. Which version of Anne do you think the world needed? The universalized, hopeful Anne of the Goodrich Hackett adaptation, accessible to everyone, devastating to no one in particular, or the more specific, more conflicted, more unapologetically Jewish Anne that Meyer Levin insisted was the only honest version of her story? Is the hope the point, or is the hope the problem?